Welcome, everybody.
Welcome.
Welcome.
Glad to have you all here for the beginning of our weekend with John Schoenheit and later in the weekend, Jerry Werewell. As I introduce John, I want to read a verse that we all know, and I think it's something that I meditated a little bit on this week, and just looking forward to John and Jerry being here this weekend. From 1 Timothy 5:17, let the elders who lead well be counted worthy of double honor, especially those who work hard in proclaiming the word and in teaching. You know, over the years, I haven't always agreed with all my teachers, to be very honest. But when I think about my history, I wouldn't even have an opinion if it wasn't for my teachers. I wouldn't be able to consider right or left, up or down, when it comes to the scriptures. And there is so much depth and understanding that I wouldn't even begin to be able to put in the possibilities of my thought. And it's through that I can read the Bible, and so much more comes alive to me. Whether I've heard it in a teaching in the past or whether I read it in a present commentary, and I go, you know, I am so thankful for John, Jerry, for others who have worked in this as their gift from the Lord to us, that I couldn't do this. I was just talking to Bill. It's like, I'm not a voracious reader. I read and I love the Bible, but I haven't read volumes on anything. And so I'm so very thankful for the input from over the years that I have in my life, and I know that you have in your lives, that have made it possible to have a deeper and more meaningful with our Lord Jesus Christ and with our Father God, that just wouldn't be possible without your work. And so, and I know it's your gift, and I know that's something the Lord has entrusted to you, and you know, we do our gifts, and I'm glad you have yours, and you do it so well. So thank you, John. Come on up and start us off.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter. Is that okay? Sort of. Okay, great. And what Peter said about gifts is right, because I'm blessed to be able to do what I do, but I'm blessed that you can do what you do. And I think if we all learn to be comfortable with the gift that we have and walk in that gift, we'll all be blessed. And it's going to be very different. And that's one of the reasons the Bible in Romans says, don't judge one another. You know, we're all servants of God. We're all trying to serve God and do what we need to do. Now, tonight's teaching, I want to teach on some of the things about God, particularly the meaning of El Shaddai, the Hebrew El Shaddai. Now, the fact of the matter is, this is the kind of teaching that millions of people won't hear it, just because it's not taught locally a lot, and it does not interrupt your relationship with God or anything like that. It's not this huge revelatory thing unless you want it to be, because it's done a lot for me because of my personal relationship with the Lord. Because you deal with friends kind of the same way I do. That, you know, it's not good enough to just kind of have somebody there. You want to ask them questions, you want to find out more about them, and then your relationship deepens. And that's what happens to me when I read the Word. Now, I talk to people that they're like, I'm just happy just knowing a little things about God, and I fellowship with Him in the Spirit and that kind of thing. And that's great if that works for you. That doesn't work for me. I need to know a little more about God. So that's where we're going tonight. We're going to find out a little bit more about God, a little bit more about where He lives, a little bit more about the spirit world, and we're going to see it from the Scripture. So let's go to Genesis chapter 17 and verse 1. And we will start in Genesis 17:1. In Genesis 17:1, here's Abram, and he's not. And of course, we know Abram is the same as Abraham, but this is before his name was changed. And the Scripture says, when Abram was 99 years old, Yahweh appeared to Abraham and said to him. So this is not a voice. This is a vision. This is a revelation for some people that don't understand it. But God created humankind to fellowship with us. And when he fellowships with us, he comes down in the form of a human being. So God could literally, just like with Peter, God could walk up and go, "Hi, Peter, I'm God."
Nice to meet you,
You
guys.
know, and God does that, and he's done that consistently through the Word. With Adam and Eve, it says they heard the sound of God walking in the garden, because there's leaves and stuff on the ground. And they're shook up. They're like, "Oh my gosh, God's," because they know they'd sinned. So they heard the sound of him walking. And we see God show up periodically throughout the Scripture. And he shows up in the form of a human being because he created us to fellowship with him. So he doesn't show up in the form of a monster or anything like that. He shows up in the form of a human being. So in Genesis 18 or in Genesis 17, God appears. Then you say, okay, when I appeared here at Peter, well, Peter came and picked me up at the airport. How did he know to pick me up and didn't pick up the guy next to me? Because he recognized me, right. Why did Abraham know that how God looked? God appeared to him. He could have gone, what are you? You know, but he didn't. Why? Because if you read Genesis 15, God had already appeared to Abraham. So Abraham knew what God looked like. And then in the next chapter, God shows up flanked by two angels. Abraham looks up in Genesis 18 and it says 3 men stood there. And Abraham goes, "Holy Christ, that's Yahweh. Here he is at my tent." And that's why, you know, because if Abraham went and killed a calf for every person that showed up, he wouldn't have a herd left. But he runs into the young men of his, keeping his flock and says, "Get a calf, tender and good, and be ready to serve it right now." And it runs to Sarah and says, "Quick, get 3 seahs of flour." Now, a seah, if I remember correctly, is like 6 quarts. This is like 18 quarts of flour. There's 3 guys. You know how many loaves of bread you can bake with 18 quarts of flour? I mean, you know, what's the big deal? Well, he's entertaining God, for Pete's sake. And then he sees him again in Genesis 18, like I said. Then in Genesis 19, he gets, and God, and it's kind of funny because God's kind of talking to himself and Abraham's standing right there. And God says, "You know, should I show Abraham what I'm about to do?" And Abraham's like, "Yeah." You know? So he says, "Yeah, well, yeah, you know, those people down there in Sodom, they're really, really wicked. I'm going to destroy the place." And Abraham's got his nephew, Lot, right there. And he's like, you know, "Wait, God, that's not like you. Well, the judge of the earth, doesn't the judge of the earth do right?" And God's like, "Well, yeah. Well, then if there are 50 righteous men in the city, would you destroy it for 50 men? And God's like, "No, I guess not." And he says, Abraham is the perfect businessman. And instead of saying, "What if there's only 40?" he says, "Well, what if there lack 10? Now, it's not about 10. But, you know, just because you lack 10, you wouldn't destroy it, would you?" And God's like, "Well, I guess not." And God wheedles him down to where finally it's like if there's 10 guys in the city, which of course there weren't. There was one Lot in his family. So what does God do? Then he sends the angels to get Lot out, and then the Sodom and Gomorrah, were destroyed. So then, so that's Genesis and Exodus. Here's God, and he knows he's going to take Moses away for 40 days and 40 nights. And the Israelites haven't been able to come out of Egypt even yet for hardly a month and a half, and they've already griped and sinned and done all that stuff. And so God comes down on Mount Sinai, and he calls Moses and Aaron and the 70 elders of Israel up to the top of Mount Sinai. So there's 72 guys going up to the top of Mount Sinai. And it says they saw the God of Israel, and there was under his feet, and it describes the sapphire pavement under his feet. And then it says they saw God and ate and drank. And what you don't see in the English, but what you see in the Hebrew, is the first one that says they saw God. That's ra'ah, to see with the physical eye. And then the second saw, hazah, is to see with the mental eye, meaning they physically saw God and they understood what they saw. And it's right there in the verse. So they saw God then. And so through the history of the Old Testament, God comes down periodically, and they say, "Well, isn't God naturally invisible?" Yes, he is, but so are angels. Angels are naturally invisible, but they show up all the time as people. and that God does the same thing. He's naturally invisible. He naturally fills the universe, but he comes down as a human being in a lot of places. And I'm not going to, this isn't a teaching about that. So if you want a full layout from Genesis to Revelation, it's in the REV commentary on Acts chapter 7, verse 55, when Stephen looks up and sees the glory of God and Jesus Christ standing at his right hand. So you can see that whole picture. But my point is that God wanted to be relational. So here he appears to Abraham. Boom, he sees him. And Abraham, and then said to him, I am El Shaddai. Walk before me and be blameless. And what in the world is El Shaddai? Well, it's an Akkadian word. And we literally, in fact, when we look at the generation that we live in now, think about the culture of the ancient Near East, because I was taught the Bible interpreted itself. The Bible doesn't interpret itself. The Bible's interpreted by the culture. How do we know what an ark is? Things like even the horns on the altar. You go back before archaeology started. By the way, what we call the modern discipline of archaeology, where they actually used a scientific method instead of digging to see if they found any treasure, which is what archaeology was up until the mid-1800s. You just dug around and hoped you found gold or silver or something like that. But then the modern discipline of archaeology started in the 1860s. And that's when the idea was that we can actually, if we do the layers right and preserve the layers and scientifically write down what's in each layer and photograph it and sketch it and all that stuff, then we can begin to actually reconstruct ancient history. That scientific discipline of archaeology didn't start till the 1860s. Interestingly enough, what also happened between 1850 and 1900? Akkadian was deciphered. It had thousands of tablets in Akkadian. It was before Greek, before Alexander the Great conquered the Middle East, and Greek became the lingua franca of the entire Middle East, because Alexander the Great conquered all the way to the east, to the Indus River, and he conquered all the way south to Egypt. So that whole territory, Greek became a language that basically all of your intelligentsia understood. Before that, it was Akkadian. And so basically anybody in the Middle East understood Akkadian. We had no idea. We had thousands of tablets in Akkadian. We had no idea what they meant. And I believe it was 1880 that they finally cracked Akkadian. But the full understanding came between 1850 and 1900. They cracked Akkadian. Oops, that wasn't all. They cracked hieroglyphics. The Egyptian hieroglyphics have been around for centuries. Everybody knew about them. Problem, nobody could read them. Between 1850 and 1900, we learned how to read the hieroglyphics. Oops, there's Moabite. Moabite was a major language. Ruth came from Moab, for example. We had tablets for Moab. We had no idea what they meant. All of a sudden, between 1850 and 1900, we cracked Moabite. Now we can read Akkadian, we can read Moabite, we can read hieroglyphics. By 1930, they'd cracked Ugaritic. Ugaritic is a very close language to Hebrew, like Italian and Spanish. Very, very close. The result of this is that you and I have access to knowledge that literally from, even the Septuagint translators at 250 BC had lost how to read Akkadian. It became a lost language when Alexander the Great conquered and basically wiped it out. So it's been over 2,000 years that nobody could read what was the lingua franca of the ancient Near East, Akkadian. And now we've got Akkadian, Moabite, Ugaritic, hieroglyphic, that we can all read in this little tiny time period. And then that's got to be peer reviewed and it's got to get out. And then there's another problem, which is people really don't like to change, even if it's right. Yeah. For example, it's been well known for centuries that there weren't three wise men. Even John Calvin tried to get the Christmas story changed to just say wise men, and he couldn't do it. The tradition's like a steamroller that just goes and just rolls through. Like the translation in the Luke story about the birth of Jesus Christ, that there was no room in the inn. Now in 1611, they didn't have the knowledge to be able to say that wasn't right. But by the mid-1900s, we knew that the Bible did not say there was no room in the inn. It said there was no room in the guest room. Interestingly enough, the 1984 New International Version read, there's no room in the inn. The 2011 revision of the New International Version reads that there was no place in the guest room. And that's exactly right. But the 2020 New American Standard Bible still reads there's no room in the inn. And they know better than that. So why didn't they change? And the answer is fear. Because I knew it was the marketing department. I've known it for a long time, but I couldn't prove it until Christianity Today did an article that said the production of the modern Bible, and said, you start with, why would anybody want a new translation? Are we going for a younger audience, an older audience, a more erudite audience? English is their second language audience. Why do we want a new translation of the Bible? So you establish that. When you know why you want a new translation, then you go out and you find an editor-in-chief who's got the educational background and is on the same page with you to produce this Bible. Then he goes out and finds a translating team, and they translate the Bible, which then takes probably 6 to 8 years for a whole team of people if they're top scholars. And then the next step then is to give that to an English department and a bunch of English PhDs, and they read it, and this sentence doesn't make any sense, and we need to change this verb and that kind of thing. So then they change it. Then it should go to the public, but it doesn't. It goes to a marketing department. And the marketing department, this is all in the article, it was in Christianity Today. The marketing department looks at it, and they say, will this sell to our audience? Is our audience liberal? Is our audience more conservative? Because in 1952, the scholastic world was really excited. After centuries of not having these languages, we now knew Akkadian, hieroglyphics, Moabite, Ugaritic, and we're going to produce a new Bible, the Revised Standard Version, in 1952, and everybody's super excited about it. At least all the scholars were, and all the academic, because we're going to be able to do things in the text that nobody could do for centuries, because we just didn't know what the words meant. And so they produced 1952 Revised Standard Version, Isaiah chapter 7, behold, the Hebrew word is Alma. Alma means young woman. Behold, the young woman will be with child. The traditional reading of the King James Version and the earlier versions, behold, the virgin will be with child, which then matched Matthew, even though it doesn't say virgin in Hebrew. It says young woman. So they translated it young woman. Translator's victory. Marketing, disaster. As soon as the Bible came out, the Christian world labeled it the reverse standard perversion and didn't buy it. Didn't buy it. Publishing house lost millions. The translators were frustrated, and the publishing house said, we're not paying anymore for a Bible that people won't read. And so they translate Bibles. That's why the 2020 NASB still reads no room in the inn, when we've known for decades that's not the proper translation. And it leads you in the wrong direction. It actually mistells the whole birth of Christ story, frankly. And that's part of the problem with translation, is when you translate something wrongly, you reinforce a wrong doctrine, and you don't allow room for a new doctrine, a proper doctrine to come in. So here we are. We're looking at Genesis chapter 17. It says, I am El Shaddai. And almost, I would say, in 90+% of your English versions, it says, I am God Almighty. Where did that come from, and what does El Shaddai mean? Well, now we know what we never, because Shaddai, it's not a Hebrew word. Whatever it is, it didn't come out of the Hebrew. And so now all of a sudden we've got all these other languages, and we can look at them and, what do you know? That word occurs in Akkadian. And what does it mean? It means mountain. And what does El Shaddai mean? God, God, the one of the mountain. Fabulous. What's that mean? What does that mean? God, the one of the mountain. And as we'll see, that in the spiritual world, there are mountains just like there are mountains on earth. And we need to learn to think differently about how those things work. One of the things that we learn, and this is something that there's no verse that says this. There's verses that concur with it. But now that we've all of a sudden got these written records from all these cultures at the time of the Bible was written, okay, say the Canaanite god Baal, where does he live? On top of a mountain. In fact, actually, in most of the Canaanite myths, he lives on top of a mountain called Mount Zaphon, which is really well known. It's a very, very imposing mountain, huge, on the Mediterranean coast of northern Syria. And it's so well known because it was because you could see it. It just stood up like an Everest, this huge mountain. And so it's written about in the Canaanite writings, the Ugaritic writings, the Egyptian writings, because they all sailed boats around the Mediterranean. They all saw that mountain and they all used it as a marker. So Mount Zaphon is extremely well known in the mythology, not even the mythology, in the records of the ancient Near East. And who lives on top of Mount Zaphon, according to the Canaanite myths? Baal. Let me ask you this. Who lives on top of Mount Olympus?
Zeus.
Not only Zeus, but Minerva. You know, there's a whole list of, they're called the Olympian gods. You know, so you have Zeus, you have Mars, you have Minerva. You've got this whole list of Olympian gods that live on Mount Olympus. Now, let me ask you a question. What's the deal here about living on a mountain? What is the big deal that you want to live on a mountain? And what we'll find out, we'll go into Isaiah chapter 14 here in just a jiffy. But what we find out is that we think about the earthly world, and we'll learn that when God created the heavens and the earth, by the way, it wasn't flat. The earth that God created for people to live in was at least hilly and sort of actually mountainous. And we'll see that from the record in Genesis, which is kind of hidden, but if you read it right, it's right there. So anyway, you've got these mountains. Well, who lives on a mountain in the spirit world? God does. And not only God, but his assembly of elders live, or at least convene, on a mountain. And God, with his divine assembly, rules the world from this spiritual mountain. And that's why Satan says, I'm going to scale the mountain of God. Let's go to Isaiah 14. Okay, finally there. Thank you very much. Now, E.W. Bullinger, by the way, does a really good job with this, and so do some other commentators, because, you know, this is talking about human kings, and then in verse 12, it shifts, and it begins to talk about Satan. And liberal theologians don't get this because they don't believe in spirits. In fact, there's a lot of things that liberal theologians don't believe in that would help us out if we just understood the spiritual world. So there's a shift here in the writing, and now all of a sudden it's going to stop talking about human kings, and it's going to shift to Satan. By the way, we don't know the pre-fallen name of Satan or Lucifer. Lucifer comes from the Latin and just means shining one. It's actually in this verse, in the Latin text. So Lucifer wasn't his name. Satan wasn't his name. That means adversary. Devil wasn't his name. That means slanderer. Opposer wasn't his name, even though that appears in the New Testament, not well translated very often. We literally we don't know what his name was as an angel. He's so disgraced in God's eyes, he just doesn't ever tell us his name. He just tells us things about him. So here it says, verse 12, how have you fallen from heaven, shining one, son of dawn? And these were gods in the ancient world, and so that's what he's called. How you are cut down to the ground, you who laid the nations low, which by the time of Isaiah, 700 BC, he'd had 2,300 years or something to lay the nations low, or maybe 3,300 years by here to lay the nations low. Verse 13, you said in your heart, I will scale the heavens. And that is a translation we worked on a very long time, because it's very important to get the word scale correctly. Because what it tells you is he was there, but for his understanding and his self-evaluation, he wasn't high enough. I deserve better. I deserve to be higher up on the mountain. I've got this low position and I need to go up higher. So he says in his heart, I will scale the heavens. I will raise my throne high above the stars of God. Here the stars of God are the spirit beings, including angels and other spirit beings. I will sit enthroned on the mountain of assembly, on the heights of Mount Zaphon. And here, by the way, in some versions, Zaphon is translated north because Zaphon was so high and it was north of Israel, the name of the mountain became used for north. It's just like if you speak and know the Hebrew, you're in Israel, the word west is Yam Suf, the sea. The word south is the dry, because the south was to the Sinai desert, the Negev and the Sinai desert. And the word north was, the word east was to the sunrise, and the word north was to Zaphon, to this mountain. It was in the north. So they used objects, the sea, the dry, the sunrise, and Mount Zaphon to do their four cardinal directions, east, west, south, north. And so here, that's what he said. But here, I believe that the translation Mount Zaphon is more correct than simply the north, because there are no heights of the north. What does that even mean? But the heights of Zaphon were clearly visible from parts of the Mediterranean basin there. And it was the mountain on which the Canaanites, by this time, the Canaanites had well established that Baal lived there and ruled from there. So he says, I will sit enthroned on the mountain of assembly. Well, as I studied this, which was last year, I began to really put all this stuff together. I had a kind of a funny revelation, which is, if, say, 3 years ago, you'd given me a piece of paper and said, draw your conception of heaven. I guess it's flat. I would have thought it was flat. And it never occurred to me to color it. It was always, because God's invisible, so it was kind of always this like light gray, with kind of light gray, kind of see-through creatures and stuff like that. And I never really sat down and just said, what does heaven look like? You know, the abode of God and the abode of the spirits, what does it look like? I just never had really done that. And so it was through this study trying to find out what does El Shaddai mean, that all of a sudden I'm faced with, wait a minute, heaven has mountains. And not only does it have mountains, but some mountains are higher than others. And the highest seat on the highest mountain is occupied by God. And that's why in the Bible, he's called the Most High God over 50 times. Because he is the Most High God in heaven. He's the highest one on the mountain. So anyway, he says, I'm going to scale the heavens. I'm going to raise my throne high above the stars of God. I will sit enthroned on the mountain of assembly. Because that's where, when God meets with his divine council, he meets on that mountain. That's why it's called the Mount of Assembly. On the heights of Mount Zaphon, the high mountain where you can rule from. Verse 14, I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. And you can see even on many days where the clouds are below the top of Mount Zaphon. And then I will make myself like the Most High. Well, the Most High is God because he is the Most High. And for Satan to be like the Most High, what he's basically saying is, I'm going to replace the Most High. I'll be like he is now. I'll be the Most High. And then you get a look into Satan's heart. He wasn't happy to be a servant of his creator God. He wanted to rule. He's going to scale the mountain. He's going to be higher than all the other spirit beings. He's going to be ruling like God is ruling. Verse 15, God didn't like that and says, yet you will be brought down to Sheol, to the depths of the pit. And then verse 16, those who see you will stare at you. They will ponder you, saying, is this the man who made the earth to tremble, who shook kingdoms, who made the world like a wilderness and overthrew its cities, who didn't release his prisoners from their home? And so this is a description of Satan. And we get another description that is also filling in details in Ezekiel 28. So let's go to Ezekiel chapter 28. And in I've got a whole bunch of things here that aren't Bible verses. Okay, there we go. Ezekiel chapter 28. I know, my fat fingers, I keep hitting the wrong button. Okay, so Ezekiel chapter 28, and if we go to verse 11, we get the same thing as we had in Isaiah 14, where it's talking about the king of Babylon, a fleshly king, and then the subject shifts in verse 11. Moreover, the word of Yahweh came to me, saying, so we have a change of subject. Son of man, take up a lamentation over the king of Tyre. Now, the above was to the prince or ruler of Tyre. This is the king. So this is Satan. He's over the top. He's the king. Take lamentation over the king of Tyre and tell him, this is what the Lord Yahweh says. You were the seal of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. And that's where the being that later became Satan started out. He was perfect as God could create him. He was wise. He was perfect in beauty. Verse 13, you were in Eden, the garden of God. That's a different Eden than the Eden of Genesis. And we know that because of what's here. The word Eden is not a specific descriptor of a place. It simply means delight or delightful place. So you were in a delightful place, the garden of God. And again, this is going to tell us then something about the spiritual realm. When God created the earth for us, he made it a really cool place, that especially if we knock off the pollution thing, it'd be really fun to live here. He did the same thing in the spiritual world for it. He didn't create the angels and they sat around going, life is so dang boring. I can't wait till God creates the earth and makes trees and mountains and cool things. When God created the spirit world, he made it as good for them as the world is for us. And so he says, you were in Eden, the delightful place, the garden of God. Every precious stone adorned you. And then all of a sudden it's going to talk about these stones. Well, wait a minute. Carnelian, that's usually red. Peridot is usually green. Moonstone is usually gray. Topaz is usually a goldish color. Onyx is usually a brown with stripes. Jasper comes in different colors, often green. Lapis lazuli is this beautiful blue. Turquoise, as you know, is a beautiful sky blue. Emerald is a beautiful green, as you know. So all of a sudden, and I've read this for years, and it never occurred to me. It's like, wait a minute. All those colors are in heaven. Heaven is a colorful place. If you're a spirit being and you can see it, it's invisible to us. But if you're a spirit being and it's a delightful place, and it's a colorful place, and it's got gems and things that you decorate yourself with, just like our world, except that exists on a different plane in the spirit world. So he says, you were in Eden, every precious stone adorned you. He gives you all these colors. He said gold work of tambourines and pipes was in you. So there's precious metals, there's music. In the day that you were created, they were prepared. They were ready for you. Just like when God, you read Genesis 2, God prepared the earth and then he made mankind. He didn't make mankind and then there he stands in the Gobi Desert and God goes, oh, I forgot trees. He prepared the world and then put mankind in it. And he did the same thing for the demons. The spirit world. He prepared this spirit world for them, made it very colorful and fun to be in, and then he put his spirit beings in there. And so he says, in the day that you were created, they were already prepared. Verse 14, you were the anointed guardian cherub, and I placed you there. The there isn't in the text, so it doesn't. I placed you there, or I placed you in the position I gave you. I don't know. Bill and I are debating whether we should take the word there out, because basically the Hebrew text just says, you were the anointed guardian cherub, and I placed you. Meaning that where you were, that's where you needed to be, that's where you could serve, that's where you could fulfill your ministry. So whatever object you put on placed you, that's what it's talking about. So and then it goes on to, you were on the holy mountain of God. And that's the mountain in the heavenlies where the divine council of God meets, called the Mount of Assembly in the book of Isaiah. You've walked up and down in the midst of the stones of fire. We have no clue what those are. I mean, the stones of fire. What they could be is they could be different angelic beings that are like Jesus Christ, or God is called the rock. You know, that these guys are the part of the foundation of the heavenly realm because they're helping to judge and stuff. Or it could be that it's part of the decoration. You know, I mean, we just don't know. The bottom line is we have no idea what the stones of fire are. If you read the commentaries, there's lots of guesswork out there, but the fact of the matter is we don't know. Then verse 15, you were blameless in your ways from the day that you were created until unrighteousness was found in you. And that, unfortunately, is the double-edged sword of free will. When God created, God has always wanted to be loved, and he's wanted to be loved for who he is and what he does. He doesn't want to force anyone to love him. He wants to give people the opportunity to love him out of their freedom of will, and he did that for the angels. And the problem is that some people, and some spirit beings, for whatever reason, are going to find something to gripe at. They're going to find something wrong, something's missing, God's this, God's that, God's whatever, and they get mad and whatever. But Satan was perfect when he was created, and then what happens until unrighteousness was found in you. And we know that the demons are sentient beings, the angels are sentient beings. They think, they consider, they obey out of the freedom of their will. And so just like you and I have to control our thoughts. I mean, we could find something to gripe at God about. You know, I could gripe about God. You have too many verses in here that are unclear. You know, I mean, we can always find something to gripe about, and we've got to just rein our mind in and shift our mind to what are we thankful for, what are we blessed at, what's God told us is coming, and stay all excited. Well, the angels have the same thing. You know, they've been created by God. They live in a wonderful place. It's really colorful and probably really fun. God knows what kind of animals they have to goof around with. You know, they probably have pet dog things. I don't know. But I mean, we just don't know. There's so much that we don't know, and we just don't have access to because God didn't tell us, and we don't really need to know it. But in any case, whatever it was, Satan found something to gripe about, and then he was like a dog with a bone, and he wouldn't let it go. And that bitterness, that unrighteousness, that feeling of you know, being mistreated or whatever grew and grew and grew. Verse 16, by the abundance of your trade, we don't really know anything about that, what that's talking about, but obviously what his job was and what he was supposed to do in the heavenlies. By the abundance of your trade, you were filled to the core with violence and you sinned. Which means he openly disobeyed God. That's what sin is, disobedience to God. Therefore I cast you out of the mountain of God as a defiled thing, and I expelled you, O guardian cherub, from the midst of the stones of fire. So basically, God says, I kicked you off the mountain. You were on the mountain, and that's where you should have been, but you, instead of being happy with where you were, you wanted to scale the mountain. God says you wanted to replace me. You had wickedness in your heart. You had violence to the core of your being. You wouldn't let it go. So finally, it's just like, okay, you got to leave. And he kicks him off the mountain. So I expelled you, O guardian cherub, from the midst of the stones of fire. Your heart was lifted up because of your beauty. You corrupted your wisdom for the sake of your splendor. I cast you to the ground. I laid you before kings that they may see you. Verse 18, by the multitude of your iniquities and your unrighteous trade, you have defiled your holy places. So basically this is, you see this in the Old Testament, God has holy places like the space of the tabernacle, and if you go in it as a defiled thing, then you defile that as well. And so God keeps you out of those places, and that's why in the book of Numbers, God said, if the unclean people walk without a sacrifice into the tabernacle and get to the altar, they're supposed to be put to death, because they're just simply to know you don't do that. You know, you don't go and defile God's things just because you're defiled. We don't have the right to do that. So he says, I laid you before, your heart was lifted up. Did I get to that? Oh, it's a defiled thing. I expelled you, O guardian cherub, from the midst of the stones of fire. Verse 17, your heart was lifted up because of your beauty. You corrupted your wisdom. Yeah, we read this. For the sake of your splendor, I cast you to the ground. I laid you before kings that they may see you. Verse 18, by the multitude of your iniquities and your unrighteous trade, you've defiled your holy places. Therefore, and this is important, I will bring a fire out of the midst of you. It will devour you. I will turn you to ashes on the earth in sight of all those who see you. All those who know you among the peoples will be astonished at you. You've become a terror, and you will be no more forever. And this answers the question about, does Satan eventually get destroyed in the lake of fire? And theologians go back and forth about this, but if we believe, and I do, that this is about Satan and not about a human king, then God makes it clear that eventually the fire of the lake of fire will consume him. Now, to understand why it would say what it says in the book of Revelation, that you're going to burn to the ages of the ages, that phrase still just means a really long time. I have it in a commentary somewhere. I don't have it in my brain, but with Roman numerals, you know, this means 1, this means 5, this means 10, this means, let's see, D means 50, C means 100, M means 1,000, and oops, that's it. Yeah. So if you stack up a whole bunch of M's, and somewhere in one commentary, it's probably in Revelation where it says the ages of the ages. But if you stack up a whole bunch of M's and lines over the top and this and that and the other thing, you never do get to infinity. They just didn't really have a word for infinity because they couldn't imagine it. And so basically all they could do is say the ages of the ages is a really, really long time. So then we've got to figure out, okay, that's the best they can do. So does that mean forever, or is it talking about a monstrously long time? And it's verses like this that you'll be no more forever, because this fire that comes out of the midst of you will devour you, and you will be ashes on the earth. And so that's an indication that eventually, and maybe after thousands of years or millenniums or whatever, Satan will burn up. That'll be the end of him. And what does it mean when it says the sight of all, the sight of all who see you? And the answer is, if you remember in the book of Revelation, there was the pit that was the lake of fire that people were thrown in. It was outside the city of Jerusalem. And remember the chapter that says the smoke of their torment went up forever. So the people in the city, that's you and I, can see the smoke of them being burned up. And that's going to be part of, us really just kind of helping to control our minds and various other things. I don't know all what that entails, but we will be able to see that there's the devil and he's being punished. And eventually that'll come to an end. And so what we get from this is there's this mountain up in the heavens. So let's go play that back then. That God then becomes the Most High God, and God becomes intimately involved with mountains. If you remember, where did Moses meet God? On a mountain. Where did Elijah meet God? On a mountain. When God decided to put his home in Jerusalem, where did he put his home? On top of a mountain, on Mount Zion. And we can read some things about Mount Zion. But before we do, I want to read too about El Shaddai. Now, El Shaddai occurs 48 times in the Old Testament, just so you're aware of that. And also, it's kind of funny, trying to think of if I wrote down the verse here. I didn't, but if you read the commentary, the RV commentary on Genesis 17:1, in Genesis and in the first part of Exodus, God is called El Shaddai. And it's like, as soon as God lets you know who El Shaddai is, after the book of Exodus, he's never called El Shaddai again. He's only called Shaddai. It's very strange. So it went from El, God, Shaddai, the one of the mountain, to simply the one of the mountain. So, apparently what God began to do was, at the time of the Exodus, if you remember, God said to Moses, because Moses was kind of mad at him, because God said, if you do these signs, then your people will be delivered. And Moses goes and turns the water into blood and throws his stick down and stuff like that. And how does Pharaoh respond? Does he let the people go? No, he makes their life harder. And so Moses, kind of rightly so, goes back to God and says, what the heck? You told me that, God's like, so he gives Moses some more revelation to encourage him, and he says, by my name, Yahweh, I was not understood to them. So God was called Shaddai for a long time, and then there was a shift at the time of the Exodus where Yahweh replaced El Shaddai. So El Shaddai only occurs those 48 times in the scripture, and the rest of the scripture is all Yahweh, 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 Yahweh. So if that makes sense, that's kind of developing his understanding of himself. But so here's Abraham, he's up in Akkadia, they speak Akkadian, and God comes to him in a vision and says, I am El Shaddai. Well, then what happened when God appeared to Jacob? Let's go to Genesis chapter 28. And in Genesis 28, because Isaac has a wife from Akkadia, his father Abraham apparently very fluent in Akkadian, and in Genesis chapter 28, verse 3, this is Isaac, and he's going to bless Jacob and send him away. And so in verse 3 of Genesis 28, Isaac says to Jacob, may he give you, verse 3, may El Shaddai bless you and make you fruitful. So here's Isaac calling God El Shaddai, not Yahweh, but this is before the Exodus. So Isaac is blessing Jacob in the name of El Shaddai. Then, you remember Jacob, and he had the revelation of the mountain, and the ladder and all that stuff. Let's go to Genesis 35. And this is God introducing himself to Jacob. And as far as we can tell, Jacob had never seen God before this. But in Genesis chapter 35, verse 11, verse 9, it says, God appeared to Jacob again when he came from Padan Aram and blessed him. And God said to him, wait a minute. Verse 10, God said to him, your name is Jacob. And then verse 11, God said to him, I am El Shaddai, be fruitful and multiply. A nation, even many nations will come from you. So it's interesting. Abraham knew God as El Shaddai. Isaac knew God as El Shaddai. Jacob knew God as El Shaddai. Then Jacob and his family go down to Egypt. And while he's down in Egypt, God reveals himself to Moses as Yahweh. And after that, Yahweh becomes the dominant name, and El Shaddai kind of fades out. Does that make sense? So that's the history of what's behind that. Now, let's go to Psalm chapter 2, verse 6, because now God has to pick a mountain in Israel that he wants to be his home. And in Psalm chapter 2, which my computer will go to in a minute, being recalcitrant, verse 6. And God says, I have installed my king on Mount Zion, my holy mountain. So here in Psalm 2:6, God calls Zion his holy mountain. Let's go to Psalm 9. In Psalm 9, verse 11. Sing praises to Yahweh who sits enthroned on Zion. Declare among the people what he has done. So again, Yahweh's going to sit on Zion. Interestingly enough, when David is writing Psalm 9, remember there's no temple yet. So what's on Mount Zion? And what's on Mount Zion is the tent that David pitched. If you remember, the Philistines captured the Ark of God. And the Ark of God, they had the Philistines had the Ark of God, if I remember correctly, I think it was something like 7 months. Then they returned it to Israel. And then it was in Israel for 20 years. But nobody brought it back to Jerusalem or, whatever. And I guess during that time period, David got settled. He was the king. He had conquered what we call the city of David. And God showed him to set up a tent. If you remember, there was an angel of fire over the threshing floor of Araunah. And also the prophet Gad came to David and said, go to Araunah and buy his threshing floor, and that's where David set up the tent. So God picked the mountain himself where he wanted the tent to be, where then David, when he came to Jerusalem with the Ark of God, put the Ark of God into his tent on the mountain that you and I know is Mount Zion. And so that's what this is saying. Verse 9, 11, Then if we go to, sing praises to Yahweh who sits enthroned on Zion, go to Psalm 48:1. So what we're seeing here is a number of verses about Yahweh and Mount Zion. And now this one is a very interesting one because it compares Zion, where God's going to rule, to Zaphon, where the locals knew Baal lived and Baal ruled from. So God's the true God, so it's like, no, God's going to rule from Mount Zaphon as well, because he's going to rule over the whole earth. So verse 1 says, "Great is Yahweh, and greatly to be praised in the city of our God. His holy," and this is where they broke the verse funny. That should have been the end of verse 1, and verse 2 start with his holy mountain, but they broke the verse funny again. We got to remember that the verse breaks were way back in the 11 and 1200s. And so they didn't have the understanding of the Hebrew and the flow of the Hebrew and the meter and all that stuff that we do today. So great is Yahweh and greatly to be praised in the city of our God. His holy mountain, beautiful in elevation, is the joy of the whole earth. Mount Zion, the heights of Mount Zaphon, is the city of the great king. So here Mount Zion is the city of the great king, and it's compared with the heights of Zaphon, where Baal ruled from, and everybody in the Canaanite religion around knew that and understood that, and so now it's like, no, I'm the real God who should rule on the top of the mountain. So then we know, well, what happens? We all know the history. Jerusalem gets burned by the Babylonians. The Persians let the people go back and sort of rebuild Jerusalem. Then there was a whole bunch of wars between the Greeks and the Hasmonean kingdom and that kind of thing. Finally, you get to the Romans in 63 BC. The Roman general Pompey conquered Israel. And in 37 BC, they set up Herod as the king. And right away, Herod began to build the temple. So he's starting to build the temple now, and that platform is still there. We see that today. And, it's kind of interesting because there's been, I would say with the increase in the Muslim influence of academia at this point, and you may have heard this, I certainly did my research because I was interested, are they right or not? But they say that, where they say the temple is now, which is where the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque are now, and they're saying that was not ever where the temple was. In fact, even the last tour, when we went up to the Temple Mount and got a tour by a tour guide he's Muslim, he does tours of the Temple Mount, and he said, there's never been a Jewish temple up here on the Temple Mount. Made that very clear. There's never been, of course, he's dead wrong. But anyway, that's what they believe, that's what they teach, and that's kind of begun to infiltrate kind of liberal theology. And they'll say, that the temple of God wasn't ever here. Well, of course, archaeology disproves that very clearly. First of all, one thing that they say, it's a Roman encampment, except we know exactly what Herodian stone looks like. And we know that because Herod was a huge builder. In fact, we call him Herod the Great. Archaeologists call him Herod the Great Builder because he built the Western Citadel in Jerusalem. He built his palace in Jericho. He built his palace in Caesarea. He built his palace on Machaerus. He built his palace at Herodium. He built palaces everywhere, and he used very distinctive building methods. Well, the other thing that he built was he built the Mosque of Abraham over the grave of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in Hebron. And if you look at that edifice, which is huge, it's a gigantic edifice, it has exactly the same stonework as the stonework when he built the temple in Jerusalem. Because, as an Idumean, and he's trying to curry the favor of the people of the Jews, so he's going to build this huge edifice over the tombs of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then build this huge 37-acre edifice for the temple of Yahweh in Jerusalem, and the stonework is exactly the same. And you can go there today. I've gone there, as you know, I've made many trips to Jerusalem and Hebron, and the stonework is exactly the same, and you can see that. So the point was that here's Herod, and he starts building the temple. And so he's got the temple there, and it's being built, and he's building other things as well. And so the temple was being rebuilt. Well, then it talks about the temple is destroyed, and then Christ comes down, Revelation chapter 19, and fights the battle of Armageddon and conquers the earth. Now Zechariah says that the Messiah will build the temple of Yahweh. And starting in Ezekiel 40 to 48, you have the temple that's built in the millennial kingdom. And some people don't believe that, but I absolutely believe it because Jesus Christ has to be the high priest and that kind of thing. But anyway, so they build this temple on Mount Zion. Well, look at Ezekiel chapter 40. So in Ezekiel chapter 40, he says, this is Ezekiel, he says, in the 25th year of our captivity, and he's timing the captivity there with the captivity of Jehoiachin. In the beginning of the year, on the 10th day of the month, in the 14th year after the city of Jerusalem was struck down, on that very day, the hand of Yahweh was on me, and he brought me there. By the way, the hand of Yahweh, generally in the Bible, it's hard to prove, but generally in the Bible, that indicates there was some kind of tactile feeling. It wasn't just a vision that all of a sudden there's just a vision. It's more like God kind of walks over and grabs his arm and kind of, come on. And that's generally what it means, that there's some kind of tactile feeling. This is not just a visual revelation. The hand of Yahweh was on me and he brought me there. Verse 2 says, in the visions of God, he brought me into the land. So now he's going to see the whole land. And set me down on a very high mountain on which there was a structure like a city on the south. And now if you read this chapter, the 8 chapters, Ezekiel 40 to 48, you find out this high mountain is Mount Zion. The structure on top of the mountain is the temple. The structure on the south end or south edge of the mountain is the city of Jerusalem. And it gives the work for all that. Now look at Isaiah chapter 2, verse 2. In Isaiah 2, verse 2, it says, in the last days, the mountain of Yahweh's house will be established as the chief of the mountains. It will be raised up above the hills, and all nations will stream to it, because Mount Zion is not the highest mountain, and even in Israel, certainly not the highest mountain on the earth when God built his temple. But when Christ rules over the earth and the millennial kingdom, the geography is going to change, and Mount Zion is going to be the highest mountain on earth. And to make sure we understand that, he says this a couple times. Let's go to Micah chapter 4. So we're in Isaiah, we're going Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah. Chapter 4, and in Micah chapter 4, verse 1, and in the last days, the mountain of the house of Yahweh will be established as the chief of the mountains, same kind of wording as in Isaiah. It will be lifted up above the hills, and people will stream to it. Many nations will come and say, come, let's go up to the mountain of Yahweh and to the house of God of Jacob. Let's go to Zechariah chapter 14. Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. So this is the next to the last book of the Bible, the very last chapter in Zechariah, in verse 10. And verse 10 says, and the land will be made like the Arabah, which is the valley. The Arabah is the valley by the Jordan River, from Geba to Ribbon, south of Jerusalem. And she will be lifted up and will dwell in her place from Benjamin's gate to the place of the first gate to the corner gate, from the tower of Haneel and the king's winepress. Men will dwell in it, and there will be no more curse, but Jerusalem will dwell safely. So the land around will be lowered, and Jerusalem, she will be lifted up and will dwell in her place. So we've got 3 verses that talk about Jerusalem, the mountain of God, being lifted up. And then let's go to, well, I don't want to go yet to the, we're here, and let's see. I want to go back to Ezekiel 47, because I was going to go to Revelation 22, but we'll go there in just a second. So we go to Ezekiel and chapter 47. And in Ezekiel chapter 47, it talks about the water. And let's just read verse 1. He, this is an angel, brought me back to the door of the house, that's the house of God, the temple. And behold, water was flowing out from under the threshold of the house toward the east. For the front of the house, the front of the temple, faced toward the east, which it always does. And water was coming down from below the right side of the threshold of the house, south of the altar. And then you read, and it talks about the water as it flows away from the temple. It gets deeper and deeper and deeper. So what you see here is, here's the millennial kingdom. Christ comes down, conquers the earth. The geography of the earth changes. The mountains and stuff settle down. Mount Zion, where God's temple is lifted up high. And then out from the temple comes the water of life. And Ezekiel describes that water flowing downhill and to the east. But if we go to Zechariah, let's go back to Zechariah chapter 14. And in Zechariah chapter 14, and it's interesting the way God split this. I don't know why he did. But in verse 8, it says, and in that day, talking about the future, this will be the millennial kingdom time, in that time living water will go out from Jerusalem, and we know from Ezekiel it comes out from the temple on the top of the mountain, half toward the eastern sea, and that's the Dead Sea, half of it toward the western sea. That's the Mediterranean Sea, and it will be flowing in summer and winter. Yahweh will be king over all the earth, and that day Yahweh will be alone and his name alone. And the land will be made like the Arabah, which again is lower and flat. So the land around is lowered, the amount of that God's going to be, and we're all going to be there, and we're going to go visit that temple and all that stuff, just like you have to go see the feasts and stuff. And so the temple will be on top of a mountain. The water of life is coming down out of the mountain, and then eventually going out and covering that whole area of earth. Now let's go to Revelation chapter 22. And I won't go to the verse that you're probably familiar with it anyway, that says that the city of Jerusalem at the time of the end, when it comes down from out of heaven, will be about 1,200 miles square at the base, and the height of it will be the same. And so it's a pyramidal city. It's like a pyramid with its height and its base, all of equal dimensions. And at the top of that pyramid is the throne of God and the throne of Jesus Christ. And so here we're talking about then, this is not the millennial kingdom, this is our everlasting future kingdom. And it says in verse 1, he showed me a river of the water of life, bright as crystal, coming out from the throne of God and from the Lamb. The throne of God and of the Lamb. So here again, what we've got is the millennial temple. You have Mount Zion, the highest mountain. On the top is God's temple, and out of that temple, flowing east and west, is the water of life. And as you look at kind of life in general, if there's no water, there's no life. So, it's just, you need water to have life. You need water to have animal life, plant life, human life, fish life. You just need water. So in the millennial kingdom, the water of life comes out of the millennial temple, top of Mount Zion. In the everlasting temple, the water of life comes out from the throne of God and from the throne of the Lamb up at the very top, and runs downhill and then feeds the earth. So one more pattern, how we doing time-wise? You guys are a great audience. Are you okay for about 10 more minutes? Okay, let's go to Genesis. So Genesis chapter 2. Because what I want to show you is there's a pattern here. And the pattern is that God originally, remember him way back in Genesis 1, let us make humankind in our image. God's always had a divine counsel he works with the Tower of Babel. The men are down there sinning, and God says, let us go down and see what they're doing. In Isaiah chapter 6, the voice from heaven, God says, who shall I send and who will go for us? God has always worked with a divine counsel. That divine counsel meets on what in the Bible is called in Isaiah and Ezekiel, the mountain of God and the mountain of Ezekiel. And it is a mountain in the spirit world. We don't have access to it. It's a spiritual mountain. But there's always been a mountain. Then when the devil was thrown to earth, He still wants to be like God, so where does the devil set up his stuff? He goes to mountains, so he goes to Mount Olympus, he goes to Mount Zaphon, he goes, and the different cultures all have mountains where their gods are. And why is that? Because it's still the gods wanting to show themselves that they're higher than other people. Meanwhile, God himself shows himself as the most high God, which, as I said, occurs more than 50 times. By the way, I should show you this too. If you're in Genesis 2, keep a ribbon there, go to Luke chapter 2. Because here come the angels. See, if God wanted this to happen, really, then he'd give us thinner fingers. But anyway, so you guys know the angels show up to the shepherds, and so the angel talks to the shepherds and stuff. In verse 13 of Luke chapter 2, and suddenly there was with the angel a multitude of the heavenly army, praising God and saying, "Glory in the highest places to God, and on earth peace among people with whom he's well pleased." Well, when they say glory in the highest places, the word places in italics, it could be the glory in the highest positions. But in any case, the spirit beings with the highest positions are also in the highest places. So as long as you get the idea, and this is the angels saying this, not the shepherds. The angels are saying this, glory in the highest places to God. Well, who holds the highest places in the spirit realm?
God.
Yeah, God and his assembly of elder spirits, of ruling spirits. So these angels on earth are saying, even all these spirits up here, these highly placed, very powerful spirits, they're giving glory to God because the Savior has been born. So that's what's going on here. Let's go back to Genesis chapter 2. So Genesis chapter 2, starting in verse 4, this is the history of the heavens and the earth when they were created, in the day when Yahweh God made the earth and the heavens. And this verse 5 is before any shrub of a field was on the earth, and before any plant of the field had sprung up, because Yahweh God had not caused it to rain on the earth, and because there was no man to till the ground. And verse 6, and this is different, springs went up from the earth and watered the whole face of the earth. Now this traditionally got translated mists, but the scholars agree that mists don't go up, mists come down. And furthermore, there's most of the modern translations go with something other than mists. Springs is a normal one. If I remember correctly, the Septuagint reads springs as well, but it's water that comes up out of the earth. And so we go with springs. By the way, this Hebrew word, the reason people don't know what it is, in all of the Hebrew literature that we have, it only occurs twice. So we just don't have enough context to really tell what this word means. But anyway, so springs come up out of the earth, or water comes up out of the earth, or wet things come up out of the earth, and watered the whole face of the earth. Verse 7, and Yahweh God formed man of the dust from the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. And we could talk about evolution here, but we won't take the time to do that. But there's just no way you can work evolution into this. But anyway, verse 8. Now, verse 8 becomes very powerful and very important, and it's misunderstood, and I misunderstood it for years. And finally, I think it was the year before last, or maybe 1 year earlier than that I really got a handle on this. And it says, Yahweh God planted a garden in Eden in the east. Now, I always called it the Garden of Eden and thought the name of this garden was the Garden of Eden. What's your garden named? I don't know, but I named mine the Garden of Eden. But that's not what it's saying at all. The word garden is the Greek word for the Greek word is paradisos, which we get our word paradise from. So that's the word garden, and it would be literally the Lord God planted a paradise in Eden in the east. And Eden is not the name of the garden. The garden is a paradise, but it's planted in Eden. And Eden is a territory. And we'll be able to see this as the scripture develops. But for example, this is like me saying, I planted a garden in Florida. And if you use the word paradise, I planted a paradise in Florida. And then one of the important things then about understanding the word paradise is that if you take that word and run it through the whole Gospels, here you have God starts with a paradise. Of course, we know the fall of man ruined that paradise. Then you fast forward to Luke 23 with the thief on the cross, and Christ said, you will be with me in paradise. And then when Christ establishes the millennial kingdom, Paul says, I was taken, in 2 Corinthians 12, I was taken away to paradise. And that's part of what gave Paul his hope, was that God showed him how cool the millennial kingdom would be so that he could stand fast in his hope. And then you go again forward to the book of Revelation, and it talks, we saw the river of life come down from the throne. In Revelation chapter 2, the river of life flows through the paradisos, the paradise of God. So you've got the paradise in Eden, the paradise that's the millennial kingdom, the paradise that's coming in the everlasting kingdom. And this was God's plan to put humankind in paradise. Adam and Eve fell, and we had paradise lost. But because Christ will conquer the earth, we'll have paradise regained. And then there'll be the war, the final war in Revelation chapter 20, where the devil gathers up his army, fire comes down and destroys them. The city of God comes down from heaven, huge giant pyramidal city, lands on earth. The water of life comes down out of that city and runs through the paradise of God. So here it's God plants a paradise in Eden, and the word Eden, unfortunately, is it's not mistranslated, it's transliterated. The Hebrew word is Eden. So it doesn't help us to know the Hebrew word. We want to know what the Hebrew word means, and it means delight. And I read a commentary recently that said you could actually translate it delightful place, because that's basically what it is. So God planted a paradise in this delightful place in the east. And there he put the man whom he had found. So he puts Adam in paradise in the east. Verse 9, God had made every kind of tree that's pleasant to the sight and good for food, to spring up from the ground, and the tree of life in the midst of the garden, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And it's interesting, we also know from Genesis 1, he created all the animals. So God made the world a wonderful place for humankind. That's our model for believing that God did the same thing in the spirit world for the spirit beings. It's very colorful, it's got a mountain, maybe a bunch of hills. It's just a fun place for them, and a beautiful place, just like earth is a beautiful place for us, and it's our home. And then it says, he planted every kind of tree, food spring up from the ground, blah, 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 tree of life, verse 10. Now, watch this. A river went out from Eden to water the garden. If the Garden of Eden was the garden, then the water couldn't come out of the garden to water the garden. See what's going on? Yeah. The river comes out of this delightful place to water the garden. Well, let me ask you a question. How does water move? Where does water flow? Downhill. Everybody knows that, yeah. So that tells me that Eden is mountainous, and wherever this water, wherever the genesis of this water is on some kind of mountain, and Eden's not at the very bottom. Because as we read, the water is going to flow out of Eden, this delightful place, through the garden, get through the garden, and then break into four headwaters. And that's what the text is saying here. So it says basically, verse 10, a river went out from Eden, the delightful place, to water the paradise. And from there, it divided and became four headwaters. So once it left the garden, then it became the four rivers. The name of the one was Pison. It winds through the whole land of Havilah, where there is gold. Again, God made different things to make the earth fun for us. The gold of that land is good, bdellium, onyx stone are there. The name of the second river is Gihon. It winds through the whole land of Cush. The name of the third river is Hiddekel, which is Akkadian for Tigris. It runs east of Assyria. The fourth river is the Euphrates. Verse 15, big key verse. Yahweh took the man and put him into the garden, the paradise of Eden, to work it and to care for it. Now let me ask you, Adam's one guy. How big a territory can he work and care for? Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's about maybe 2 acres, 3 acres, 5 acres. But it's, these people are, it's after this is before the flood of Noah. You're looking for a place that's maybe 3, 4, 5 acres on the face of the earth after the flood of Noah, and people say we can't find the Garden of Eden. No kidding. Wherever it was, it's gone. It wasn't this huge. It wasn't like the state of New York. It's it's a little garden, and God puts him in it to take care of it. Now it's in a delightful place, but even so, it's a garden. It's a paradise, and so it's in this territory of Eden. And Adam has to stay there and work it and care for it. And I could just see Adam. I mean, if God put him in something like Montana, he's like, God, I don't think this is going to work. Because we know that Adam was blessed to do this. He didn't, because one of his, if you remember, one of the punishments of the fall was, in the sweat of your face, you will eat bread. And you're going to return to dust. Well, so obviously it's a blessing to work this, and it's fun, and he can do it. And then verse 16, we get into the commandments. Commanded man, from every tree of the garden you may eat, yes, eat, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you must not eat from it. But it was a revelation to me, because I always called it the Garden of Eden. And I just thought it was the Garden of Eden, that was the name for it. And it was in studying this and pulling it apart, it was like, wait, something else is going on here. And then you have to pick it apart, and you come to the conclusion that I came to, that you have this mountain on earth, these mountains. The water came out of this mountain, and when God came walking through the garden, when it says in Genesis 3 that they heard the sound of Yahweh God walking in the garden in the cool of the day. It's actually the spirit of the day, or the wind of the day, because as the sun falls, and you guys know this, that cool breeze starts to blow, so it's the actual ruach, the spirit or wind of the day. And so where did God come from? Well, if he's matching his pattern, he came from a mountain that was associated, and he comes walking down into the garden. Can't prove that, but it's just an interesting theory. So anyway, so what do we know? We know that El Shaddai is actually, one of the things I skipped, when Jerome, translating the Latin Vulgate, got to El Shaddai, he had no idea what Akkadian meant. He had no idea what the word meant. So he looked at all 48 usages of El Shaddai in the Hebrew text, and he concluded that the God who is El Shaddai is powerful. So in the Latin version, he translated El Shaddai, the Akkadian, as God omnipotens. And that's how we got the tradition, God Almighty. There's no basis for it at all. It's just Jerome's guess. But it just was the best guess that anybody could make, and it got inculcated in tradition, and El Shaddai all of a sudden became God Almighty, even though that's not what it meant. And so that's in most versions. Now, see, if Akkadian was only deciphered a little over 120, 130 years ago, it takes a long time to change traditions. And so the translators, for the most part, are kind of in a toss-up. There are some modern versions that they're not going to get involved in the fight, so they simply transliterated El Shaddai. But most of the modern versions are still sticking with God Almighty, even though if you read the scholarly analysis, they'll say probably means God, the one of the mountain. And so we went with El Shaddai and covered the meaning in commentary. So anyway, you guys have been a great audience. I really appreciate it. I'll be here tomorrow morning and tomorrow afternoon, and ask questions if you have them.